Hey guys, welcome to the Massive Iron Channel. I'm Steve Shaw. In this video, we're going to talk about the death of hypertrophy or hypertrophy, or winning the hypertrophy, or winning the trophy of hyperness. I don't know, whatever it's called, kids. I can't figure it out. It's way too complicated. Before I get into that topic, if you have any questions or comments, drop them down below. The best topic ideas I turn into videos just like this. We're going to dive into a study. I'm joined by Faz Lifts. Before we get into everything, I want you to check out a video Faz and I just did on German volume training. You want to know the ins and outs on German volume training? You want to see both of us who have never talked about it discuss German volume training? Head over to Faz's channel, link down below. So Faz, you've been on my channel enough. Everybody knows who you are. Everybody go over to YouTube and follow fazlifts.com. So I came to you with this topic. And I said, hey, you want to do it in a video? And you said, I already did it this morning. And I said, well, you asshole, you beat me to it. Not really. Not really. Guys, this is a pretty interesting topic. And it basically, I'm framing it as the death of hypertrophy, because what it's basically showing, and correct me if I'm wrong, is the deeper into a set you get, the closer you get to failure, the more you're getting out of that set. And before I toss it over to you, the reason why I call this the death of hypertrophy is because this, in the modern era, 9 out of 10 people that come to me, they're not training like this. They don't know the value of training like this. This is almost a foreign concept. So can you touch a little bit on the study, and maybe then after that we can dive into the modern landscape and why this disappeared?
All right. Hey, folks. So this was a really well put together study. They had two groups, and in both of the groups, they had them training for a period of time, training to failure. And then for another period of time, they had them training 5 reps away from failure. I think it was actually limb to limb. But in any case, they had a good control group set up, and then one which was training to failure, and one which was away from failure. They had a good comparison. Now, they tested a range of different things. They tested hypertrophy of the biceps, quadriceps, and also anterior delts, and they also tested 1 rep max in the squat and bench, and also vertical jump and like bench endurance. So they tested a range of different things, from not only hypertrophy but also to maximum strength output, and also to endurance, which was kind of cool, and also force output with jumps. So that was really interesting. Now, what they found was if we looked at biceps and quads, there was better growth by far with the groups who trained to failure. So not just a small amount of extra growth, but it was what they call in the research a very robust difference, a very robust increase in hypertrophy when training to failure in the biceps and the quads. And I mentioned those two muscles because that's basically what they were testing. They were testing each arm for different groups and each leg for different groups. So well, like Steve was saying, the closer you got to failure, the stronger the stimulus was, and the greater the growth was for hypertrophy. So if we just stick to hypertrophy for the time being, that's the general thing. Now, there was one wrinkle, which I guess we'll discuss a little bit later with anterior deltoids. But firstly, what do you think of that, Steve?
I'm not surprised. I mean, I'm going to dive into this in a little bit, but back in the day, Arnold was talking about getting the most out of sets, and I forget the exact quote. And basically, what I've always understood at the science, I've understood it, the deeper into a set you get, the more muscle fibers you're recruiting. And what was the downside of that? The reps in reversing has always made me a little bit mad because of that. Number 1, 3, 4 reps in reverse or reserve or whatever the hell it is. I'm too old for that stuff. But it's like, number 1, it's a guessing game, and number 2, you're not really recruiting a maximum amount of muscle fibers, and that was always my personal goal. Faz, if you don't mind me setting the table here. We've talked in videos past about how things have come full circle, where back in the day, body part splits or bro splits were the way to go. And then we got steamrolled by the frequency train. And now we're back to the science that says bro splits may be the way to go. Back in the day, I was talking about this, and it kind of did the same cycle, Faz. And I want to hear your thoughts on the why. When I put out, I always kind of push people to try to get more out of their sets. And then we move to a place where and you talked about this before we got on the video, where it's easier to communicate this more strengthy, side of hypertrophy. When I put out my book, Massive Iron, I was teaching people to push sets to the limit, and I've said on this channel probably a million times, push every set for as many reps as possible. Stop that set when you feel like your form is going to break down, or when you feel like you're going to fail on the next rep. So I'm basically trying to teach people safe sets, to take a set for as many reps as possible safely. And when I put out my book, Massive Iron, that was kind of like, that doesn't jive with strong lifts. That doesn't jive with, this program, that program. So I was seen kind of as a dum-dum or a big lumphead or a big outsider again. But now here we are back to this square. So, back to square one. So I want to see your thoughts, Faz. Why did we temporarily move from this type of training to the more strength-focused type of training?
So I think what you've said there is something that I want to pick up on, and what I think is really interesting. So there are patterns and trends. Now, the only thing is, the last 10 years, the trend has been fueled by science, right? Because if you look at the hypertrophy research, it's actually relatively new. The stuff that you and I were looking at 20 years ago, and you were looking at before then, was actually just proxy research from strength. No one ever really directly studied hypertrophy like 20 years ago. There was like the Wormbomb study, if you remember that, like 15 years ago. But there was a real paucity of research for hypertrophy back in the day. The last 10 years is when we've really had Brad Schoenfeld drive forward that research. So yes, things go in circles, but the last 10 years, it's been very much science focused. So everyone has been walking around with the I won't say arrogance, but like knowledge, and saying, yeah, I'm right. And not only am I right, but I've got these studies to back me up. Now, that's a very dangerous way of thinking, because one, it's not scientific, because science always has to be prepared to adapt and change. But two, you're placing your hat on a very new, relatively new field of research. But, if you're 25 years old or 30 years old, really, that's all you've known the past 10 years. Whereas guys like you and I, Steve, we've seen it for what it is. And actually all that research, if you remember, it was 2010 that Brad Schoenfeld actually identified what evidence-based research was in the hypertrophy field. And that was as far back as it goes. And for some people sat there listening, if you're 25 years old, that's a long time away, because you were 15 years old then. For us, that's actually relatively recent news. So yeah, things do go around in circles. There are trends. Possibly the danger with this trend is it's backed by science. So people walk around with you know what, I'm definitely right, because the science says that, and there's a certain level of gravitas there. So yeah, I think we've got to be careful though, because in doing that, we're ignoring 60, 70, 80 years of sort of experiential evidence, which I think is also very, very useful. And like you were saying, Arnold knew this back in the day, and a lot of that stuff, we're just reproving that it actually works. So this was a particularly satisfying study for me, because it basically says train to failure. Well, it essentially said the harder you train and the more you train, the better it is. And that is, yeah.
Yeah, this kind of returns us to hard training. And, you said Arnold knew it back in the day. When you were talking, I was thinking, it's not that we knew it. It just felt like common sense. Like, it felt like common sense to push things to the limit, to get the most out of something, not to leave 3 reps on the table. That's not, I'm not trying to be arrogant and say I knew better, but it just felt natural. It felt like common sense to me. And, with regards to science, Faz, we have science. If you watch Mike Israetel or listen to him recently, he'll talk about really there's no end to the volume spectrum that we know it, other than a practical end. But then we also have this from a science standpoint, which is saying, we can get more out of a set by pushing it closer to failure. So here's where science can get dangerous, Faz. We have hard sets and we have volume, and both of those appear to be scientifically valid, but you can't combine them, because you'll have a dangerous recipe pragmatically in the long run. You cannot train hard, everything to failure for volume over a long period of time without the engine breaking down. So what does that mean for the average individual?
So this is how I like to look at it, and it's how I explained it in my video, was that if you ignore just intensity versus volume for a second, because I don't want people to be sitting in camps and saying, well, I'm the intensity guy, I'm the volume guy. Just ignore that for a second, pull it all away, just look at what we are. We are adaptive organisms. We are evolved beings, creatures, whatever you believe in. This is not a question, a talk about that. This is more just the fact that we are beings which adapt to our environments. Now, if we think of the level of intensity of the exercise that we do as an adaptive stress, if we think of the amount of that we do as also an adaptive stress, if we look at it from a top-down point of view, like, okay, if there is more of both types of stress, then we are going to have a stronger adaptive stimulus. As long as we can recover from it, we're going to get greater amounts of growth. So for the average guy on the street, you've got to remember this. Okay, are you growing? Maybe not so much. Is your food intact? Okay. Well, in that case, you probably need more stimulus, whether that's working out harder or working out more often, or working out more, sorry. Now, if you are able to work out harder, that might be a more time efficient way of doing things. If you aren't, like, let's say you just aren't a very aggressive person, you just don't have it in you to really go all the way out. Okay, well, maybe you want to compensate with a bit more volume. As long as we understand that, you're probably going to be compromising your growth because you should be pushing both up. So I guess that's kind of how I look at it. Stress is what we're putting on ourselves in terms of, and as long as it's the right type of stress, we can modulate that for gain. So the average guy on the street needs to remember that. If you're not growing and your diet's in check, it probably is a matter of you need a bit more of both or one or the other, depending on what you are able to deliver.
So for the average individual watching this, wondering where to start, it's better to start on the low end of the spectrum. If you're going to start to include intensity work, and when I say intensity, we're not talking weight relative to your 1 rep max. We're talking pushing a set closer to failure. If you're going to start incorporating that, it's probably better to start on the lower end of volume just to kind of get a feel for what you're doing. If you want a practical application on how I combine volume and intensity for the average individual, that is kind of weaning into both, because we have come from a strength-centric kind of hypertrophy world where it's all barbells and 5x5 and whatnot. And doing volume and doing intensity can kind of be foreign things. And that's why I called this video Death of Hypertrophy. What I generally do for my clients, Faz, is we're not just jumping into every set push to failure. What I do is last set push to failure, or pushed for as many quality reps as possible. I hate to use the term failure because I do not let my trainees push a set to the point where form breaks down. We're not going to get injured. There's too many variables. But I will have them do, say on bench, 8, and then max reps. So we're getting 1 set out of 3, or 1 set out of whatever that exercise scheme is. That's pushed for as many safe quality reps as possible. So we're getting a little bit of the volume. We're getting a little bit of the, pushing sets for a limit. And from there, we can kind of adjust things. Some people, it takes them a longer time in the gym, so we have to pull back volume a little bit. But I'd rather pull back volume a little bit, if that's you, and keep that more intense set in the mix, rather than dumping the intense set and keeping the 3 to 4 sets for say barbell rows. So that's basically how I structure things for somebody that comes to me. And Faz, it's interesting. I didn't really derive at this from science. It's just kind of been my experience with working with people. If you're new, Faz, for folks that are new to training to failure, or training a set for as many quality reps as possible, we talked about this a little bit before we hopped on, that every set has, it's important to note that every exercise has a different set of demands. Can you explain to those watching what that means?
Yeah, so I think when it comes to big compounds, and particularly big sort of compound barbell exercises, that's going to be inherently a lot more demanding. But with that comes a lot more risk. So with those lifts, I'm talking about your squats, your deadlifts, stuff like that, you may not want to go right the way to failure. In fact, I've very rarely seen people go to true failure on squats, but it is tremendously demanding. So bear in mind, in this study, they were looking at single joint isolation exercises. So leg extensions for the quads and single arm bicep curls. In that situation, I definitely think there's a lot to be gained by going to failure. And as we saw in the study, there was a high amount of failure. I wonder, Steve, if the results would have been different here if they had looked at, say, squats and bench presses and somehow had, two groups set up in that way. I wonder if perhaps that'd be different, relative to what we're talking about here. What do you think?
I don't know. It's an interesting question. The thing you get into with some exercises is that the deeper you go, the greater you increase the risk of injury. And all you need to do is go to a powerlifting meet to see the potential hazards with training near failure. So for those of you that are watching that think, Faz might disagree with me, and that's fine. But for those of you, I don't want anybody going out and training every lift to failure just because of the study. It's important to understand, and I've stressed this, and I've stressed this point earlier, and I'm going to stress this point until the day I die. Practice safe sets. Push a set and stop it when you feel like you're going to fail on the next rep or when you feel like your form is breaking down. And that's essential for highly unforgiving exercises like squats and deadlifts. If that means 2 or 3 reps left in the tank, that's fine. Live to fight another day. We're not trying to get you killed. We're not trying to get you injured. And if you compound this type of research with the fact that the average person still has only a cursory knowledge of squat and deadlift form, they're still in process. I'd kind of like to move squats and deadlifts out of this picture a little bit, and they're not necessarily, just squats and deadlifts for me are like in the background. Get your form down, and then they can enter the conversation. So, Faz, any final thoughts on this study, or any thoughts in general on
I've got a couple of other things that I wanted to touch on. So I think firstly of what you said here about squats and deadlifts, some of that is common sense, but then part of what makes these conversations with you and I, Steve, so useful and important is that common sense isn't so common, and so quantifying exactly what we're talking about is really helpful for people. So I would agree, squats, deadlifts, and these big compounds which have got a high risk to reward ratio, I would say probably don't go all the way to failure. It's going to be quite risky, and you don't necessarily need to get the full benefit because inherently they're going to be a lot more stressful. For the single joint exercises like what was studied in this study, I would say almost certainly the ceiling for disastrous injury is probably a lot higher. So go nuts. So that's the first thing. Second thing was something that you mentioned a little while back, and that was the intensity. I agree with you on this. I generally start off newer clients on the low end of volume because I want to set intensity at a high bar first. Now, I'm not saying we're going to go to failure. Like we said, it depends on the lift. But I want to make sure we've got a good degree of intensity on all exercises before we start adding volume. I view volume as a sort of a volume knob, like basically a volume knob. So the stimulus is making sure we have the intensity right first, and then increase volume as and when we need to. That's kind of how I see things. I've got one more point, and I'll just go ahead and make that go ahead real quick.
I want to interject. With volume, it's kind of like you slowly, and when you say slowly, there's adding a few sets here and there, but you turn up the volume. And then once the volume is turned, it becomes more like a movie or an opera or something more cinematic, or where there has to be pacing, where there's some value in desensitizing yourself from the volume and then coming back to it. So you don't have to get overly complicated with volume periodization, but once you are in that sweet spot with volume and intensity, there is some benefit every now and then from desensitizing and coming back up the volume ladder. But that's a whole topic for another conversation. So, Faz, you said you had one final point.
Yeah, one more. So I wanted to just discuss how you would know when to increase volume, and just to give you a bit of a theoretical perspective on that. I like to think of the factors which influence when you would decide to take the next step up and increase the volume as looking at what your level of anabolic resistance is. So if you think about what I said earlier, the level of volume and intensity, that's all the top-down stimulus which causes adaptation. Now, how much of that you'll need is going to depend on your level of anabolic resistance. And we know certain factors affect that. So the more advanced you are, generally you have a higher level of anabolic resistance. So you need more stimulus to actually grow. And that makes sense. Most people will realize that they needed more stimulus now, certainly more structured, more adapted, more advanced than they needed the first month they stepped in the gym. Secondly, age seems to have a tricky relationship with it. Certainly training age matters. I think also they've seen in studies that level of body fat tends to affect things as well. So the fatter you are or the leaner you get, the better your anabolic resistance is. The fatter you are, the worse it is. So you need more actual stimulus to offset the level of general stress in your body, which can then cause adaptation. So if you're sat there thinking to yourself, well, look, I've not grown very well for the past couple of years. And yes, I am a little bit older now. I am more advanced. I'm maybe stuck at a plateau. I'm recovering okay, but in general, over the last sort of year or two, I've probably not grown that much. That might be your cue to say, okay, I need to up the level of stimulus. So that could either be the intensity or it could be the volume. If you're already training reasonably hard, but you're probably only doing 10 to 12 sets or even 12 to 14, you may well need to hit up more sets, 16 to 18 to 20. But again, not to put an exact number on it, but just to say from a top-down perspective, think about things that way. You will need more volume over the course of your training career, and certain things like age, training advancement, and obesity or just level of disease in your body will affect that.
I will say as just a final thought, one of the main reasons people don't get to the end game in genetic muscle growth potential, and not that, any of us ever truly get there, is because the deeper into the weeds you get, the deeper the weeds get. It becomes harder and harder and harder. The strength demands and the training demands. I've talked about this many times on this channel. Anybody I've seen with a real top quality amount of muscle mass is a strength beast, and they just train at a whole different level. It's hard to explain, Faz, to somebody that's not seen it, but they have that sweet spot of volume. They're just crushing the weight. They might even have, sets just taken to the limit. When I'm doing 150-pound dumbbell benches, I'm stopping when I literally can't do another rep. And that's, so just know there's that kind of midpoint phase where people get in hypertrophy where the weight feels heavy and it requires a lot to move forward. And, I just I'm not trying to discourage people, but I'm trying to paint a realistic picture. At that point in the weeds, the demands, if you want to get to where you got to go, you really need to be smart and really step up your game.
I'll just add one more thing just to finish that off. Like, I talk about stress because I don't just want to talk about higher and higher levels of volume. Oftentimes you'll see when guys are very advanced, their actual volume tolerance goes down because they're lifting weights so intensely and so heavy that their quality of work is right up there. So the stimulus they put on their muscles per set is a lot higher. So you often see guys who are about to turn pro, who have gone pro, actually do less volume. Again, thinking of you guys like Dorian Yates and a few guys that I interviewed who were top amateurs a couple of years ago, sets per week were probably in that 10 to 12 range. So it's a difficult one to quantify. You need more stress as you get more advanced. I'm not necessarily saying it's always more volume, but it's just certainly a higher degree of quality of work. And sometimes you might just clean up your form and it might be enough.
Yeah, the stress is an important thing, and it's important for people to know it can vary per exercise. On dumbbell rows, each exercise has different demands, and dumbbell rows can feel very much like cardio at the level where I like to do them. And I would go in fast and do my deadlifts, which took forever because of all the warm-up sets. And when I got to dumbbell rows, I would do one set of like 200 by 30, and I'd be done. Like I would always do my left arm first because it was weakest, and then finish off with my right arm. But the level of intensity and effort and focus that I put into just that single set for each arm, it was the most intense thing I did in the gym all week. So, guys, that's about it. We're going to wrap it up and cut it right here, 25 minutes. I want you to head over to Faz's channel, check out our video on German volume training. If you're really curious to see what our thoughts are. We don't discuss this in advance. We're just kind of hashing it out like we do on this one live right in front of you guys. So guys, hope this video has been of some help. If you have any questions or comments, drop them down below. If you made it this far in this video and have yet to subscribe to my channel, please do. I'd appreciate the support. So guys, as always, thanks for watching. Have a great day.